Did you ever hear about the time the Hallmark Channel tried to adapt one of the greatest works of gothic literature of all time? Frankenstein? Yes, Hallmark, known for their endless factory flow of holiday-themed rom-coms, decided to take the foundation upon which all horror and science fiction is based upon and went, yeah, we can make this work. This works. We can do this. And by the way, not just a movie, but a 3-hour-long miniseries aimed to be the most faithful adaptation of Frankenstein ever produced, which, you know what? Honestly, despite how often Frankenstein does get adapted, they aren't really a lot of faithful adaptations. Most of them take a lot of liberties. Listen, I don't know if you've seen Alvin and the Chipmunks meets Frankenstein. They weren't exactly very, focused on book accuracy. Frankenstein might be one of the most iconic stories of all time. The novel starts with a ship locked in the Arctic ice, happening upon 2 dog sledders. Oh wait, you don't know that part of the story. Oh, that's right. That's because none of these films adapt the story in its entirety frequently. It's one of the least adapted elements, the ice element right there. Despite some estimates placing there being close to 500 Frankenstein adaptations, very few of those adaptations actually take the events of the novel. Mostly just take the character of the monster and plop him in something. You know, again, Alvin and the Chipmunks meets Frankenstein exists, and it was not a book adaptation. Most of these films draw far, far less from the original book and more from James Whale's classic 2 adaptations for Universal: Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. For example, the flat-topped look, the green skin, the bolts on the neck, the moaning and the groaning, that's all Jack Pierce's iconic makeup and Boris Karloff's incredible performance as the monster. But that's not the monster from Mary Shelley's novel. In fact, it's a vastly different beast altogether. In fact, in the entirety of the 2 Whale's films, none of them fully adapt a scene from the book. Now, the 2 most famous scenes in the first movie, the "It's alive" scene and the scene with the little girl who she gets thrown into the lake and drowns, neither are from the book. Now, Bride of Frankenstein is based on an idea suggested by the original novel, where Frankenstein, the scientist, is pressured by his monster to create a bride for the monster. Not for him, he's already engaged to someone else. But he does not complete this bride. Though, in fairness, Bride does adapt that scene in the book where the monster finds temporary companionship with a blind man, even though in the book he's not a hermit but rather the patriarch of a family of many, with a loving family around him, his son being married to a woman, this, that, and the other. Anyway, the 2 most ambitious attempts, as I can find, to faithfully adapt the book prior to Hallmark's attempt were the made-for-TV film Frankenstein the True Story and Kenneth Branagh's adaptation Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was cashing in on the success of Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, neither are remotely close enough to the book to count as a faithful adaptation. The True Story focuses on Henry Clerval, Victor Frankenstein's friend, becoming the famous monster, where Victor brings his friend back to life after something happened, and hijinks ensue. Now, Henry will be important when you get to Hallmark, but most adaptations kind of either reduce his role or combine him with Victor's brother, and the James Whale's version actually combined Henry Frankenstein with Victor's younger brother, and then switched his name with Victor's name, so he's Victor Frankenstein, and it's a whole thing. Anyway, Henry will be in the Hallmark film, and an actor you would not expect to play him does play him, but we'll get to that later. Now, it's a melodrama, and I like the idea of the monster being beautiful at first before physically rotting away in public. That's an addition the True Story makes that I think is kind of neat. The monster appears to be this beautiful man, but over time, because he's a shambling corpse, rots in the public eye. And it's always fun watching Victorian-era people who are all stiff and proper seeing something repulsive and having to react. I find that kind of fun. Then there's Kenneth Branagh's attempt, and it's a weird movie, as you would expect from Kenneth Branagh's adaptation. They do get a lot right. A lot of scenes are taken directly from the text that hadn't been fully adapted to that point and at such a large budget. They even include the dog race to the North Pole, but there's something wrong with the whole film. Frank Darabont, the director of Shawshank Redemption and the writer of the film, called it the best script he ever wrote and the worst film he's ever seen. Which is a choice. It's entirely due to the choice of putting Kenneth Branagh one of the most operatic directors of all time, in charge of this film. I mean, Kenneth Branagh does a lot of literary adaptations, but the skills used to make Hamlet are very different than to make this gothic, miserable, sad horror film. And all that to say, when Hallmark released their adaptation in 2004, there wasn't a lot of competition on the market, you know, in terms of faithful adaptations. So how did Hallmark do? Did they succeed in bringing this classic novel to life, or did they struggle to make it alive? Well, the first thing you notice is the cast is actually pretty stacked. The core two performances are from character actors. You might not recognize him at first. The monster is played by Luke Gross, who I know best as that prince from Hellboy 2, and Alec Newman plays Victor Frankenstein. Now, I know him best as playing Paul Atreides in the 2000 sci-fi miniseries adaptation of Dune and Children of Dune. And would you be surprised to know that in the video I make, I will be referencing Dune more than once in this video because there's a surprising amount of overlap between this miniseries and that miniseries. But the rest of the cast, it's wild, and you'll see some actors you would not expect to be in a Hallmark production as we keep going. A lot of classic actors and some rising talent who, considering what roles they went on to play, is pretty funny to hear. We'll get to that later. Let's dive into episode 1. The miniseries is broken up into two 90-minute episodes, and we start on the Prometheus, a ship bound for a new path through the Arctic, an ambitious voyage of discovery, hampered by, well, ice. What do you expect? Now, when the ship gets trapped in the ice, this novel and the show presents this as kind of a parallel to Victor Frankenstein's journey and his ambitions. Now, both the ship's captain and Victor want to discover something new, something incredible that can change the way the world works. A new trade route or the secrets to life and death. You know, very similar. But run into unintended consequences that jeopardize everyone involved in their lives. And when they find the consequences, they want to turn back, but they're locked in place, unable to escape without careful consideration. Though I will say, I think it might be easier for a ship to escape the ice, considering they brought ice-breaking equipment, than Victor is at surviving his fate with a monster after him. Now, the first actor we see is Donald Sutherland, of all people, as Ship Captain Walton. Now, the late Donald Sutherland is, in my opinion, one of the greatest actors of the 20th century. A lot of you guys know him as President Snow from The Hunger Games, but he has a long history with horror, being in two of the greatest 70s horror films of all time, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Don't Look Now, both of which have some of the most haunting endings I've ever seen in a horror film, and I won't spoil what happens in both of them. You just gotta see it and take my word for it. Anyway, in this miniseries, he's the guy who finds Victor and his monster chasing each other in the snow on ice sleds. Now, Victor almost drops dead out there because he's a mortal man in the freezing cold of the Arctic, so Captain Walton brings him in and they try to take care of him. So we now have our framing device from the novel adapted. One of the least adapted parts of the novel, by the way. And we're leagues above the competition already in terms of faithfulness, but can we keep it going, and does this hamper the pacing of the narrative? One reason a lot of people cut this part out of the book is because people want to see the monster. They want to see the mad science, the creation, man tampering with God, the gothic melodrama, and being stuck in the snow and ice, not really a gothic environment, really. And it really does take you out of the position of getting ready to see the horror. So, as an adaptation, does this work? Well, they try to make some tension go on about here. We keep cutting back and forth between the narrative of Victor Frankenstein's life and the ship captain talking to Victor. And as we do so, we get a kind of pseudo-ticking time bomb of sorts, where they keep noticing that on the periphery of the snow and ice, the monster is lingering, waiting, listening, drawing nearer, and no one knows what to do when he gets there. That tries to add tension to the setting that isn't there previously, but then again, what value does that really hold for us, the audience? Does that really make us feel on edge? Because we care more about Victor's story than what's happening on this ship. The novel wisely has everything take place on the ship, but we're hearing the story through Victor's words, and therefore, what happens on the ship is kind of inconsequential. We're being told the story from Victor's perspective, just as the captain is hearing the story from Victor's perspective. That's the value of it. In the Hallmark adaptation, it kind of feels like they're taking us away from the stuff we want to see. Now from here, Victor tells us his story of his life, as is the case in the book. Now, this section in the book takes place over the course of 18 years or so, and it's more more of a montage of sorts. It's a few pages. But in this mini-series, it's basically the first third of the first episode. A full half hour of content taken from a few pages of the text. James Whale's film wisely jumps straight into Victor constructing his monster, as well as his friends and family being worried that Victor hasn't returned their letters, that he seems very mysterious and agitated. This is also part of the film, but it takes a little while to get there. It's very serene and pastoral, and there are these scenes of young love, family bonds, and brightness. The lighting in these shots I think is very interesting, because at first it's very flat but bright lighting, and as we get closer to the creation of the monster, the lighting becomes more shadow heavy, more dim, dingier, and sets that were once brightly lit are now filled with darkness to reflect the inner turmoil within Victor. That being said, of course, I'm not going to say the lighting is necessarily fantastic, but it's something. We're working with something here. It does make familiar sets seem very alien to us as we go. But half hour, it's a long time for getting the stuff the audiences want to see with it. Some might say this brings down the pacing of the film and distracts us from what the audiences want to see. The monster, the laboratory, etc. And I don't necessarily agree with that fully. Like in the book, these scenes add some value to the plot. One, it shows that Frankenstein came from a happy home hinged by tragedy. And two, it adds contrast to the horror that will come later. And finally, three, it establishes why Victor is so damn obsessed with bringing the dead back to life and conquering the secrets of the world. And I gotta say, I love some of the morbid conversation that breaks up the pastoral life. The little kid playing Victor has some of the most morbid questions with such a childhood-like joy as he's saying it. And it's so screwed up, but I guess they kind of gloss over just how out of left field this whole thing is. This is where the film also chooses to adapt another less adapted component of Frankenstein. The fact that Victor is in love with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is his adopted sister. I know, who would guess this adaptation of Frankenstein would have something in common with Oremo, or other anime of its ilk, but that's the world we live in, I don't have to tell you. Now, in fairness to Mary Shelley's original novel, yeah, it's weird. It is very creepy. It is basically his sister. But she's less a sister to Victor and more of a ward under the care of House Frankenstein, who Victor grew up with. Despite being a poor girl of no prospects, the household brings her in very charitably. And I gotta say, the relationship between Victor and Elizabeth, despite being a lot of love scenes between them and these sweeping romantic scenes they're taking picnics and twirling and playing, they feel flat. Elizabeth doesn't get a lot of development in the book, but most adaptations do flesh out her character a little more. Now, when you consider that the story of the novel is being communicated verbally from Victor to the captain, it makes sense that Elizabeth is idealized to Captain Walton. Now, adaptations try to do more with her. In the James Whale's version, for example, Elizabeth almost becomes a Cassandra figure, like the Iliad and the Odyssey Cassandra, having a sixth sense that predicts evil coming into their lives, but no one really believes her. Now, the Hammer films, which make Victor Frankenstein into a villainous mad scientist, more in common with Herbert West than the original Victor Frankenstein, they make Elizabeth more of an abused housewife, more of a vulnerable, timid character who is treated terribly. And Kenneth Branagh, Kenneth Branagh decides to create a love triangle between Victor the monster and Elizabeth, culminating in her becoming the bride of the monster Frankenstein. Branagh does not understand the concept of subtlety, and it shows. Usually it works well, but not in this one. But here, Elizabeth is someone who loves Victor, and she serves as an anchor for his joy, and later helps pull Victor out of his dark obsession with creating life. It's telling that Victor descends furthest into madness when farthest from Elizabeth, both when studying university and at the film's climax. So we got that going for us. But as a character, Elizabeth kind of sucks. But anyway, we learn that Victor at a young age became obsessed with death, after watching his dog get run over by a runaway cart, and shockingly, Hallmark decided, yeah, let's just show the dog getting run over. What kind of John Wick bullshit is this? And I gotta admit, this bit kind of took me aback a bit, because I don't think it's in the book. I don't recall there being dogs getting run over graphically by carts being a main impetus in the novel for Frankenstein's journey into university. I mean, what really pushed Victor into studying was his general means of interest, as well as the death of his mother from scarlet fever, something the Hallmark movies also adapts. But why add the dog death? Why show the dog death? It's not necessary to the plot. I mean, it does tie in with a minor plot point later, but there are ways they could have done that without having to do this. And I will add, the scene they do doesn't really work all that well either. It just seems like a surprisingly shocking and cruel scene for a made-for-TV miniseries from the Hallmark Channel. That said, anything shocking I think is good, because it does jolt you. You don't expect it. Also, it's not as cruel a death as the ending of VHS 2, and no, I will not show you that scene because it's really upsetting, and if you like dogs, that's really hard from VHS 2, if you really want to see that for some reason. But anyway, changing the gears, Dan Stevens is in this movie as Henry Clerval. Yeah, he is the most, and of course, as Dan Stevens often is, he is the most entertaining actor in the film, who has no shortage of roles with monster movies between Abigail and Godzilla x Kong. And he's Henry Clerval, as I said before, Victor's childhood friend, who you may recall in some adaptations becomes the monster. Now here, he's just a really close friend who runs off with Victor to get a liberal education at college. And listen, okay, this is, first off, him going to college with Victor, another unnecessary deviation from the book, but it works here because Dan Stevens is so entertaining. Now in the novel, Victor goes to college alone, and Henry stumbles on Victor shortly after he creates the monster and thinks his friend looks ragged and tired and brings him home with him. Now here though, Henry has a function. He is someone Victor can talk to, and his distance from Henry indicates how far gone Victor has gone into his obsession. Now, because when Victor is as most manic and most depraved, Henry is pushed out of his life. And I gotta say something else too. And this is something my spouse also said while watching this with me. So it's not just me going wild with something or, whatever. But Dan Stevens, he plays Henry like a repressed gay man who is crushing on his male best friend. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the physical contact, the way he keeps gazing at Victor with his smile just lingering on his face. But there's something about Dan Stevens' performance that feels repressed homosexual to me, without ever explicitly saying it. Which, hey, brave of Hallmark, did that in 2004. Truly, really brave of them, I'll say. And I don't know if it's intentional or not. It might just be Dan Stevens was just so happy to be there, and he got excited and just kept staring at people too long. But it feels gay. It comes across as gay. But from the most entertaining performance of Dan Stevens, we come to the worst. William Hurt plays Victor's college professor. And look, I don't like Hurt in anything he's been in. I don't like him as Thunderbolt Ross. I don't like him in Altered States. I don't like him in Children of a Lesser God. I especially don't like him in the 2000s sci-fi miniseries adaptation of Dune, where he plays Duke Leto Atreides, father of Paul Atreides, which makes the scene with him and Newman kind of a reunion scene, kind of. And bizarrely, he also shares the scenes with another actor from the 2000s Dune series who appears here, and that would be Ian McNeice. Ian McNeice plays another professor who's just kind of there, who shows up in a couple of brief shots, and while my parents might know him as that guy from Doc Martin, probably what most normal people would recognize him from, I saw him and went, oh, it's the Baron Harkonnen from the 2000s Dune miniseries from Sci-Fi Channel. That old classic. And honestly, I kind of wish he played William Hurt's role, because he's a much better actor, surprisingly, than Hurt, who's the Academy Award nominee or whatever. And listen, side note, on the Dune miniseries, it has arguably the best, my personal favorite version of the Baron Harkonnen, where he's more of a Shakespearean villain who monologues and cackles maniacally, and he's kind of over the top, but he's not as disgusting as the David Lynch version of the Harkonnen, or as much as I love the new Dune movies, Baron Harkonnen is more of a shape, a presence in a scene, rather than a compelling character in and of himself. He's one of the parts of the new Dune movies I'm not as big on, but anyway, back to this. I'm getting sidetracked. I could talk about Dune all day, and I will. Anyway, so back to William Hurt sucking. So every scene where William Hurt is in, he has this lifeless quality to him, made all the more apparent by how enthusiastic all the other actors are. He looks bored in every scene. He barely emotes. He barely expresses any emotion on his face. He just does some stupid accent. And by the way, no one else has an accent in this movie. He's the only guy with an accent. And tells Victor, oh, study more. Oh, Victor, don't create life. You cannot create life. That is God's domain. And when Victor first goes to school, the movie gets really boring because Hurt sucks the life out of every sequence. If not for Dan Stevens overacting, these bits would be excruciating. Again, entirely because of Hurt. So anyway, they kill another dog in the movie. Yeah, 2 dog deaths in basically 20 minutes at this point. And this is the payoff for that first dog death. Because Victor, while walking the streets of his college town, stumbles on another dog getting run over by a different cart, and takes the dog corpse home with him to bring it to life as part of the early phase of his experiments, to test the equipment to make sure it works. And it does. It comes back for a few seconds, looks around, glances, looks like a cute dog, then lays back down again and dies again. Now, here's why I have an issue with this scene. When the dog is brought to life, he moves around just fine, even though he should be in excruciating pain after being run over by a cart. Like, it hit his neck, it hit his legs. He should not be able to lift his head up, lean forward, look like a normal dog. He should be in excruciating pain, unable to move. And what I think would have worked better is if the dog was obviously in agony, but Victor, blinded by his ambition, doesn't notice or maybe doesn't care. He's just so happy he brought something back to life, he doesn't seem to care that the thing he brought back to life is in agonizing pain. And even though the dog does die seconds later, I think it would be more effective to the audience if the dog didn't look fine when it came back. But Hallmark Entertainment, in their infinite wisdom, thought it'd be better if we just kill the dog, bring him back to life so he looks and acts like the dog that's on your lap right now while watching this movie, and then just lays down and dies again. That's way better for a family audience that we're appealing to. Actually, this whole subplot's bizarre. Why even do this? Why not just have, like, Victor experiment on, like, a rat he found, or some dead animal that no one actually has an emotional attachment to? Like a dog. Maybe I'm biased because I hate when dogs get killed in movies. I don't know. That's one of my things. When Michael Myers can kill 15 teenagers in his films, and it's fine. But he kills the one dog in the first Halloween film, and oh, he's pure evil. That's how you know he's pure evil. Killing his sister, no. Killing a dog, that's how you know. That's how you know. Anyway, in a scene that actually starts off really interesting but ends terribly, Victor starts snatching bodies from the graveyard, and briefly brings along William Hurt to show him what he's doing. And it's here again where Hurt's underacting ruins what could be a potentially disturbing scene. We are seeing Victor go into a mass grave and pick up bodies, and William Hurt just looks slightly annoyed at it all. And it's amazing how a scene with so much potential, with Newman acting really manic and really in a clever way, Hurt just kind of ruins it. And it's here, roughly 40 minutes into the movie, that we finally get to the moment. Now, for a lot of people, that's way too long, And you know what moment I'm talking about. It's the creation of the monster, the It's Alive sequence. And I gotta say right now, I really dig the lab they have for this movie. It's more Hammer horror than Universal. More beakers and chemicals with wiring than overt electrical devices and chargers. Victor has this kind of jerry-rigged antenna on top of the dorm building that's sticking up, and lightning's coming down to catch the lightning. It looks like something a student would make. It looks realistic for Victor to make it. And the limited budget and smaller sets actually plays into this by making it feel like a cramped college dorm that he's twisted into an evil lab. And there's a sequence where they have the monster, they have a cloth on the monster's face, and as they bring him to life, we subtly see the cloth flicker as he breathes into it. This sequence, up until this point, is really effective and haunting and powerful. But then we get to a problem. As in the book, Victor brings the monster to life, the monster rises, and the moment Victor looks upon his creation, he flees. All adaptations have some variation of the sequence, with the only exception really being Young Frankenstein. And Young Frankenstein, of course, is one of the only adaptations where the monster and the scientist have kind of a healthier relationship. I mean, it is a comedy after all. But here, Victor runs like a baby the second he sees the monster. And we come into a problem here. The scene originally works in the book because it's all internalized. We see Victor's thoughts as they flow through his head. The monster frightens him, scares him, horrifies him, but here it's too fast. We get now the internal dialogue from the book. And so after languishing and build up, we get to the scene where the monster exists and it feels rushed. The monster and him look at each other for a second, and Victor runs like a baby, and the monster just gets up and leaves the estate. And it, again, just feels disappointing. Now here we divide the film into two sections. Henry and Elizabeth, the two loves of Victor's life, find him and nurse him back to life. Also, William Hurt's there to suck out the soul of every scene he's in. But the other half we follow the monster as he comes to understand life in the real world. Now, in the original novel, we see the world from Victor's perspective first, only to have it reach the death of his younger brother, and us realize shortly after that the monster's accountable for it, and then the monster shows up to tell his side of the story. All of this is told through the narrative, and it kind of adds this element of mystery and tension, what's going on, how that happened. The miniseries takes a different route. By having them go side by side, these two events, seeing Victor happier and recovering while the monster descends further and further into misery and torment, we get a sense that Victor has escaped consequences for now, but there's still something brewing. We still see the results of his actions, even though he can happily ignore it. Now, the monster himself looks kind of not monstrous. He looks like Severus Snape from Harry Potter if he got throat surgery. So he doesn't really look like a truly evil-looking creature. When you see Boris Karloff or Christopher Lee or Robert De Niro, you see them as the monster and go immediately, yeah, these guys are terrifying, I'd run away from them. But here, he looks like a kind of a homeless man, a very sad human adaptation of Frankenstein's monster. And the miniseries doesn't run away from that. It shows the monster less as something frightening and more as someone who just can't fit into society. He has to steal to survive. He's lingering where he's not welcomed to look for some companionship. He projects his own sadness onto others. And the fear isn't that he's frightening looking, but that he is this stranger in their lives who doesn't make sense to them, who's kind of forcing his way in to survive. And that's frightening and sad too. And the fact that he looks so human, like a scared, vulnerable person, makes it kind of, to me, feel more like the experience of a marginalized person on the brinks of society, rather than necessarily a monster who is a sin to God itself. Frankenstein adaptations tend to be either tragic or horrifying. And this version, it's way more tragic, but not all that scary. And it's here in the last half hour of the first episode that the tragedy becomes the showcase. It's what we wanted to see this whole time. Does it succeed? After all this build-up, is it worth it? Well, the monster scenes are told mainly through visual language, because the monster doesn't talk too much because he has no one else to talk to. And it follows the book fairly closely, despite the changes being made to the monster's appearance. From wandering the woods getting berries, wandering into town, stealing and being chased out of town, finding a family on the outskirts of town with a blind grandfather and a husband and wife, and he lingers in their shed, he does their wood for them, and he has a chance at happiness when speaking to the blind patriarch of the family. He finds temporary companionship, but then is run out when the family comes back home and is scared by him. But there are a few changes here. For one, the family has a daughter, and we see a scene where the monster approaches the daughter from behind that's extremely reminiscent of a certain scene from the classic Universal film. I guess they couldn't resist that one. But the biggest difference I can note is the monster's intelligence. See, in the original novel, the monster learns how to read and all that by observing the family. The young daughter is being taught, and he gets a chance to look at a reading material and learn from it. But here the monster expresses intelligence from the get-go. When he leaves Victor's home, he knows he has to put clothing on. He knows how to open up doors. He knows how to speak and communicate already. He doesn't learn how to read from the family. He is born with that knowledge because of the brain he had, presumably. And this makes the monster, again, more human in this adaptation than previous adaptations. What he learns is how to function in society, but he already knows the basics that he needs to survive. But on the other hand, this also makes scenes, again, where the monster's being chased by mobs as a little real, because the monster just doesn't fit in. He's a homeless man wandering around, and people find him repulsive, not because he's a monstrous figure, but because he's some homeless deviant walking around town stealing from them. And it's frightening. It makes me think a lot about actual real-life people who are like that. They are treated as repulsive, and it's very sad. You know, it's a heartbreaking thing. It's a little real at times. And this all culminates, of course, in the monster reading Victor Frankenstein's notebook, which he stole from Victor's lab, figuring out where Victor lives, going there, and murdering Victor's baby brother. In the books, the murder of Victor's baby brother is almost treated like a mystery, like I said before, where we don't know who really did it, but we can figure out it's the monster before he tells us directly, I did this. But the murder is also not premeditated in the books. He stumbles on the boy, gets into a scuffle with him, and the boy reveals his family name, the House of Frankenstein. And that triggers rage in the monster's heart that leads him to uncontrollable anger. And before he realizes it, the kid's dead. But in this adaptation, they film it like it's part of the monster's revenge against Victor, and he's seen more as a slasher villain. descending into villainy at this point in the film, with the low angles, the shocking lights, the heavy shadows. But, of course, we have another episode to go. And the episode ends with a promise of more to come. Alright, we finished the first episode, but I want to take a quick break real fast to answer a question. Why would the Hallmark Channel do this movie? Well, Hallmark in the 90s and the early 2000s was a very different beast in terms of film than it is today. In fact, one could argue it was an entirely different company. In 1994, Hallmark Cards acquired the company RHI Entertainment. Now, what is RHI? Well, RHI was a company that first became known for distributing classic Laurel and Hardy work that MGM already owned. They also did Filmation and other works such as that. In 1990, though, it was acquired by New Line Cinema, which at the time was best known for one key franchise, A Nightmare on Elm Street. During the 90s, New Line produced some of the most iconic films of the decade, like The Mask and many, many others. This culminated in arguably one of the greatest film trilogies of all time, The Lord of the Rings. Suffice to say, RHI working with New Line was a huge win for the company. New Line wanted the company to manage its library of films for TV and later the home market. It also helped produce made-for-TV productions and miniseries shows the like. But when RHI was acquired by Hallmark, the company used RHI, which they renamed as Hallmark Entertainment, as their television production branch, and made a lot of good stuff. Ever seen that version of A Christmas Carol with Patrick Stewart, or the made-for-TV Dinotopia adaptation? All Hallmark Entertainment, all made by the company formerly known as RHI. But then in 2005, a year after Frankenstein came out, this miniseries you're watching right now, Hallmark sold the studio off. It eventually ended up in the hands of Chicken Soup for the Soul Entertainment. You know, the company makes those Chicken Soup for the Soul books, the same kind of Hallmark schmaltz that Hallmark makes, but from a different brand. Well, it didn't end well, though, because Chicken Soup for the Soul ended up getting into a lot of scandals. You know, for such a wholesome company, there was a lot of controversy behind the scenes. Employees weren't paid, debts were piling up. In 2024, after appealing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the company was forced to file Chapter 7. And maybe 5 bankruptcy nerds know what I'm talking about, but to give you an idea, Chapter 11 bankruptcy is usually to reorganize your debts, but the business keeps running, whereas Chapter 7 is total liquidation to pay off debts. That's an overly simplistic way of saying it, but suffice to say, Hallmark sold off its best production studio to another company that was basically just Hallmark, and then that company ended up dying. Hallmark Entertainment did nothing wrong, but it got screwed anyway. It's a deeply sad story, and also explains why, at the end of 2005, Hallmark went from producing quality adaptations to Christmas-themed slop. But, what are you gonna do? I guess they're making more money with the Christmas slop, so maybe quality is not necessary to producing a successful product. So, that break aside, let's watch episode 2. We jump right into the action with Victor investigating the murder of his brother, and miraculously, despite finding no concrete evidence, he deduces the identity of the killer almost immediately, that being his monster. Real Sherlock Holmes here, I guess you can say. I do suppose he has a slight advantage in creating the monster, but what are you gonna do? I don't know. This is despite, mind you, not knowing where the monster went, having no reason to believe the monster knows his name, or where to find him for that matter, and, as we later learn, not even knowing the monster exhibits any signs of intelligence whatsoever. Now again, this is what happens in the book. Victor also in the book figures out it's the monster very early on. However, in both the book and film, the police think they have their suspect, Justine. Well, who's Justine? The maid. The maid's been here the whole time. Didn't you notice the maid? Did I mention the maid? Oh, well, the maid's there. And they blame the maid because they found a possession of the brothers on her person, which, I mean, that's kind of like not really strong evidence. I mean, it could have fallen off and the maid picked it up and forgot about it. Who knows? But the thing is, the police really want to find a perp, and Victor just keeps crying about some big monster running around, so there's really no other suspects. There's no other suspects but the maid. And to make matters worse, Justine confesses to the crimes under police interrogation, and that's enough. She's brought to the gallows to be executed. All of this plays similar to how it is in the book, with a couple big exceptions that really change the way the scene affects the story. Let's start with one big one, that being Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth in the book seems convinced that Justine couldn't have been the criminal, which gives her something to do, having emotional moments with Justine, dreading the outcome, and feeling extremely depressed after the execution. And this gives extra guilt to Victor when he concludes that
he is at fault for making the monster that killed his brother. But in the Hallmark version, Victor fights for Justine's innocence, saying it was a monster, saying he knows who did it. He knows what the crime was. No, he has no evidence. He just can't prove it happened. However, the book does something a little different. Now, in the book, Victor also knows the monster did it. But at this point in the book, Victor's almost convinced himself the monster coming to life was a mad fever dream. Obviously, that's not the case. But more importantly, in the book, Victor does believe Justine is innocent. He does conclude the monster did it, but never says anything about it. While he does say Justine is innocent, he gives no evidence and no explanation for who did it instead. Victor remains quiet. Now, it's not necessarily out of fear of no one believing him like they do in the miniseries, because in the miniseries he shouts, "It was a monster who did it," and the police are like, "Well, where's your monster? Where's your proof? Provide us a shred of evidence and we might buy your story." That's not the case in the book. In the book, he doesn't speak out because he fears others holding him accountable. He knows that if he speaks out, he may be held accountable, especially if he explains where the monster came from and people conclude he is indirectly responsible for the death. Because he is. Instead, he watches as Elizabeth descends into deep-seated melancholy and still says nothing to anyone, because speaking out would mean someone might blame Victor for the crimes. The crimes, of course, that are the result of his experimentation. But in the adaptation, the only person upset over Justine's passing is Victor and the monster, but we'll get to that. Elizabeth doesn't seem upset. No one seems upset beyond the shock of knowing Justine committed a crime. There's no deep-seated depression or ramifications beyond that, and of course, Victor tries everything he could to have saved her, and it just didn't do enough. The adaptations make both Victor and the monster way more sympathetic, but that also means robbing the characters of their actions in the plot. This adaptation seems intent on making the monster and Victor tragic, but tragic means bring about your own fate through your own actions. This is seen all the more when the monster shows up to Justine's execution. Victor sees him quickly before, losing track of him, and after the execution, the monster comes to take Justine's body to apologize privately to it. The monster and Victor are presented as victims of circumstance, but is that as compelling as seeing them bring about their own downfall through their own violent or self-centered actions? Who's to say? Well, I am. It's not as interesting. But ultimately, all of this is the beginning of the episode. Because what happens is the monster visits Victor when he's drunk and asleep in his desk and leaves a note telling him they must meet at the ruins on top of a mountain, on top of a foggy mountain. And I gotta say, seeing this set piece made me realize, yeah, this is Frankenstein. It's a foggy cliff of a dying remnant of mankind's creative abilities and hubris. We get Victor with a gun while the monster is lurking in the background, lurking in the trees, following him. Victor trying to kill the very thing reaching out to him for some form of human connection. This is Frankenstein. And yet, it is a strong deviation for how this scene plays out in the book, even if tonally it feels appropriate. Now, in the book, the monster does not summon Victor at all. Victor goes on a hike and stumbles upon the monster, who has been following him and lurking around him this whole time. He's been stalking him, and Victor happens upon his stalker. Of course, the terrifying thing is, the monster's been following Victor without ever noticing it. Think of all the horrifying potential of that. You ever see the movie The Strangers, where you notice that there's a man lurking in the background of a shot the whole time, and he's just there and does nothing but walks away? Why have no adaptations of Frankenstein adapted that element of just the monster lurking in plain sight, doing nothing and walking away, and no one notices him? And there's a lot of potential horror there that's untapped in adaptations. Again, food for thought. So yeah, in the adaptation, they find each other and they get into a bit of a fight. But the monster just wants to talk, so the fight doesn't really go on for too long. This is where we learn the monster didn't mean to kill Victor's brother at all. Now, as I said before, in the book, Frankenstein kills the brother out of rage, but also as a means to exert some control over a controlless world. But here, he wants to keep the boy quiet, and so tries to smother his mouth and accidentally kills him. He didn't mean to, but it happens. His intent to control the world results in unintended harm. And that's kind of a theme with the monster. He's not here to cause harm, but his attempts to add control just bring about misery around him. Whereas in the book, this is intentional. This is the monster claiming some semblance of control in a world so far outside of his control. Also, that said, even though the monster killed the brother accidentally, he still planted the evidence on Justine, with the sole intent of knowing this would hurt Victor. Now, here's where the adaptation struggles a bit. Adaptation struggled a lot with how sympathetic the monster is. In the Wales version, for example, the monster is incredibly childlike. Any harm he does is incidental, not purposeful. Other versions, like Branagh's film, make the monster far more vengeful, far more malicious. He is a force of violence and exerts that violence against the person he blames for his pain. But here, Hallmark plays it a little closer to the book, where the monster is born vulnerable, seeks companionship, but ultimately takes out his rage against the world, against his creator, who seems unwilling to help him find some form of solace. Every violent action the monster takes in the book, however, is softened in this adaptation to feel more incidental or more eye for an eye punishment, except for Justine. The murder of Justine is the point where the monster truly acts monstrous. The monster plants evidence on Justine as well, but in the book it feels more aligned with the character we've come to realize. It feels like the evolution of what we're seeing. But here in this adaptation, because they've softened all the other edges, it comes a little bit out of place. They take a middle ground with this, which works to an extent. It does feel slightly uneven. It does feel a little rough of an adaptation. There's some jolts that come in. There's some shocking acts of violence from the monster that feel all the more shocking because the edges have been smoothed off. But anyway, the monster summoned Victor here, so what does he want? Well, he wants to convince Victor to produce a bride that the monster can be with. The monster is only doing bad things because he's lonely, so with a partner, he'd have no reason to commit crime. He'd have some form of peace. And it's here that Victor actually agrees that, yeah, seeing the monster, Victor sees the potential of good within the monster. And so if a companion will help cure him of his violence, well, might as well. So Victor packs up and goes home to his old college town. And he goes out to the graveyards and digs up body parts from foggy cemeteries to begin his work. And legitimately, I really dig that part of it. Especially the shot where he's in the grave and he's digging up bodies and he has like a sack of human thighs, of women's thighs, he's just putting in there, and it's like it's gringy and gross and nightmarish and foggy. It feels like a gothic horror story come to life. But while elements are similar to what happens in the book, they are a couple of significant deviations, aside from the location, because they're reusing all the sets. The college town is the only other town really they go to, even though in the book it's in the British Isles, he's going all around, this, that, and the third, so what have you. Now the first thing that they change significantly is a superfluous appearance by William Hurt's professor. William Hurt sees Victor's in town and goes to his dorm to try to knock some sense into him, try to knock on the door, tell him to stop pursuing God's domain, and it's all superfluous because it adds nothing to the plot, as you'll see in a bit. And even more confusing, there's a scene later on with the professor, it's also added to the story, that kind of feels strangely contradictory to this scene, but we'll get that in a bit. But the other change is Henry. Now, in the book, Henry and Victor go on a retreat shortly after the brother dies, and Victor slips away to a distant region of the British Isles to do some work. Now, that's very different from the college town that everyone knows about, but I digress. And in this one, everyone knows where he's going, they all know where he is. In the book, it's more he slips away unseen and no one knows where to find him. So he's a little more withdrawn and concealed from the rest of his family. And in the book, what happens is ultimately when things fall apart, Henry is killed. It makes it all the more tragic that Henry is there naively with Victor, not knowing Victor is setting in motion events that will lead to his devastation. But here, Henry goes to Constantinople to go on an academic journey. But Elizabeth tells Henry to follow Victor back to the old college town, where Victor's doing experiments. And Henry confronts Victor. And it's here that he plays a more significant role in the story than William Hurt's professor character does. Now in the book, Victor constructs the bride, and moments before completing his experiments, begins to reconsider. His own paranoia takes hold, and he fears creating a new monster. What if the bride and the monster don't agree and they get into fights? Or worse, what if they really agree and produce offspring, a race of superhuman monsters who can tear the world apart? And in his mania, he destroys the bride. And the monster, seeing this, swears vengeance, swears he will be there on his wedding night to wreak his revenge. However, in this adaptation, the Hallmark version, Victor is driven to righting his wrongs, and he completes his monster. But Henry voices the same concerns Victor internalized in the books, the fear of these monsters creating a new race of monsters. And indeed, those fears are confirmed when the monster himself says he hopes to produce offspring with his new bride. And so that solidifies the fear Victor has. There's a legitimate fear. It's not just his own mania and paranoia. There's something legitimate now. It's external. It's put out by another character, and Victor's able to think outside of his own head, for once, rather than be stuck inside of his own brain, which results in actions that lead to horror. And what's good about this is this adaptation allows us to externalize and internalize conflict. I mean, what are you going to do in an adaptation? Have like thought bubbles or have him have an inner monologue that's audible? You know, you can show him tampering with the body, considering, hesitating, but it helps a little to have the specific fears articulated if they're so complex as a fear of a super race to destroy humanity. But the problem is, it's more sympathetic to Victor, because someone else is telling him what to do. And Henry takes some blame for his own fate by helping bring it about himself. Whereas in the book, Henry's fate is entirely outside his control. It's all Victor's actions. And Victor is acting in defense of a bigger cause, either for the monster or for the sake of humanity. Now, again, the thing about Victor in the book, you have to understand, is he's not a hero. He is the villain of the story. Everything that happens in the story is the result of his arrogance and ambition, his closed-mindedness, his narrow-mindedness, his tunnel vision, refusing to see any of the consequences of his actions as he pushes further and further into his studies, into his experiments. He gets so caught up in the grandeur of his actions, he does not see the obvious consequences until it's too late. Now, adaptations tend to take this in different directions. The Hammer films, for example, play Victor as more sociopathic, so close-minded and so unwilling to deviate off the path of his scientific studies, he's willing to kill and maim to get there, to ruin lives. The Hammer Frankenstein is a rat bastard. Other versions like Universal or the Branagh version, they're more mad scientists. They're more caught up in their own grandeur and are too lost in the sauce to realize the problems of everything they're doing. But at the heart of it all is one key thing. Victor is not as good a person as he believes he is. But in the Hallmark version, Victor is a better person than he thinks he is. And that softens the blow. Remember, most of Victor's actions so far in the book have been to avoid facing any consequences for his actions building the monster. But in the adaptation, most of them are more incidental. He has no control over it, and other people like Henry and later Elizabeth tell him he is blameless for what happens. He didn't commit the murders, the monster did. And why did the monster do it? Well, because he did it kind of accidentally in some cases. He fumbled his way in and was left with no other options. No one's really the bad guy in the Hallmark version. They're all victims of circumstances, which, yeah, that's sweet, but it's not horrifying and it's not tragic. It's more sad, and it's more easy to watch, but it's not as impactful as the book's messages of arrogance, overconfidence, narrow-mindedness, and isolation spawning acts of evil. Back to the adaptation. Henry convinces Victor that there might be some problems making a bride for the monster, and the monster kind of confirms him by saying, yeah, he wants to have babies with this monster eventually and raise a family. But Victor goes about this the wrong way. First off, he burns his notebook in front of the monster, and then as the monster is frantically trying to take the book out of the fire, lights the bride on fire right in front of him. Like, Victor, you didn't have to give the bride a uterus. You realize that, right? If your big fear was them reproducing, just don't put reproductive organs inside the bride. Say, oh, monster, I'm sorry, you know, I can't figure it out. Some things are too advanced for me. What are you going to do? Here, have fun with your bride and have fun in isolation. If the fear primarily is a fear of children, and it's something that someone else put into play, your first reaction maybe shouldn't be destroy the bride, but, you know, what are you going to do? It makes more sense when it's Victor from the book who acts impulsively and doesn't think things through already. That makes more sense, but this Victor is more contemplative, more thinking of himself, and his worst actions are the result of others inspiring him to do something else or what have you. He's much less of a instrument of his own tragedy. Anyway, Victor torches his lab, destroys any chance of making any more creations, and the monster departs shouting that he will see him on his wedding night, enacting his vengeance. Now, in the book, Victor concludes this must mean that the monster will try murdering him at his wedding night. But in the adaptation, he rightfully concludes the monster is going to destroy his bride the same way Victor destroyed the monster's bride. Again, book Victor thinks he's the most important person in the world and only sees actions that affect him directly. Film version's a little different. Now, if you needed proof that Victor was aware of his loved ones being in danger, there's a scene earlier on in the adaptation where Victor sees the monster stalking Elizabeth, and as a result, tries to save Elizabeth from this unseen force that Elizabeth can't see. Now, this tells the viewer Victor's selfless. Victor's a good man. He's potentially sacrificing everything for the safety of his loved ones. But in the book, he's an incredibly self-centered character who brings tragedy to a beautiful, innocent people because he can't think through the results of his actions. As I mentioned before, different effect. Different impact. Now, Victor and Henry help hide the burned body, with Victor taking it out to the middle of a lake and dumping it on his own. And when he rows back, he finds Henry dead, slain by his monster. And the police, for a while, think he's the main suspect. They arrest him over it. Now, that happens in the book as well, though of course the location's a little different. But then Victor is picked up by his dad and Elizabeth, and there's no evidence really pinning him to the crime, so there you go, he gets off free. They then plan a wedding, and as the wedding is being prepped, Victor is prepping to kill the monster because he knows the monster is going to come on his wedding night. And he creates this elaborate scheme involving leaving the house Frankenstein on 2 separate carriages, with one being a decoy, going to a secret retreat no one knows about, hoping to throw the monster off, and being ready to fight the monster if he comes. However, during this entire time, despite trying to do this to protect Elizabeth, he only tells Elizabeth about the monster the night of their wedding, and not, weeks in advance, because she could have prepped herself, Now, in fairness, Elizabeth did tell Victor to not tell her anything about what was bothering Victor until after they were married, which seems contrived. And again, this isn't a factor in the book, where Victor refuses to tell anyone about the monster because he fears facing any consequences for his actions, even as his loved ones are dying. He is so self-centered, he refuses to put himself at risk of any consequences for his actions. If Victor talked to someone, he might have avoided his fate, but his pride did not let him. Now, in this version, he's not above that. He's going to tell Elizabeth everything. So tell her about the monster that's coming. Tell her it's a guy trying to hurt them. And give her a gun. Give her a weapon. Get security around the house. Get something to kind of watch out for this guy coming at you. It's one guy. He's not like super strong necessarily. He's peak human strength. He's not indestructible. Just get a couple of guys and shoot him. And later on he tells people about the monster too. He tells tons of people about the monster. Where's the secrecy here? In the book it makes sense because he's so arrogant. He refuses to tell anyone about what's happening because he doesn't want to get caught. But here, he gets a whole gang of people to hunt the monster. There's people who know about the monster all over the place. Get 20 guys, situate them around the house and say, oh hey, a monster coming, attack. It seems so avoidable, despite the fact that in the book and in other adaptations, Victor takes measures to either protect himself or hunt the monster. There's a reason the angry mob is so famous, because Victor tells people there's a monster and they all go out to hunt it, It only makes sense for there to be no mob if Victor is hiding the monster's existence, which makes sense in the book, but not in this adaptation. But if you need more evidence that Hallmark Victor isn't the brightest bulb in the shed, a simple misdirect lures him outside. And while he's chasing a decoy himself, the monster breaks in and kills Elizabeth. A gun would have been helpful, or maybe like a Bowie knife or something, I don't know. But now we enter the part of the movie that I like to call Victor Frankenstein Monster Hunter. Because once Elizabeth is dead, now nothing's stopping Victor from hunting the monster down. He chases the monster down from his wedding suite, firing bullets at him, and the monster hides in the lake, and then you get a whole gang of people to search the lake for him and whatever. It's great. It's a cool start of what's going to be a really cool arc with him traveling around hunting the monster. Now, Victor goes home to find his house empty except for his father, and I really like this. Even though the first half of this miniseries was a little slower paced, there's something kind of haunting about seeing something so full of life formerly, now empty and filled with shadow. You get a sense of the silence, the heaviness of this place, now that everything is gone. And Victor's father is dying at this point, though it's not made clear in the miniseries that he's dying. They show his grave later, but it's not told to us as vividly as it is in the book. Now, Victor's father, he has some words for Victor. While Elizabeth and Henry absolved Victor of guilt before dying, Victor's father tells him that you've carried death around you all your life, that you've brought death, you've been obsessed with death, and that death has pursued his family ever since Victor became of age. And there's something kind of tragic about that. Something about that idea, it's rough. Even though we explore all that well, and later scenes I feel kind of rub it the wrong way. They kind of undercut the edge of that moment. But once Victor's father dies, Victor finds a note in his father's grave, his tombstone, and it's from the monster, leading him on back to his old college town, where he finds another message, that being a newspaper, and that leads him to a village, and that leads him to another message, and the monster leaves a trail of destruction behind him that lures him along the way into the Arctic, to where we first found Victor at the beginning of the whole movie. But there's a few things here that I think are interesting. For one, this monster hunting phase is full of this gothic, beautiful stuff. Like we see the graveyards, the foggy town streets. We see Victor in this outfit that's reminiscent of the outfit that Peter Cushing in Horror of Dracula wears when he goes out to monster hunt. It has a Hammer horror aesthetic that I personally really dig. I like that. It's neat. But it's also here where the oddest scene in the movie comes in. It's another addition that's not from the book. And it's a chance to get one last dosage of William Hurt's acting. God, I hate every scene he's in, but this one is the oddest. It's not the worst acting, but it's the strangest bit. Because I'm not sure what exactly they're trying to communicate with this scene. Throughout the whole movie, Hurt's character has been trying to convince Victor not to do his experiments, that it's an affront to God. But here, Hurt reveals he's almost envious of Victor, how he's been able to do things that are frankly impossible, while he himself is restrained, shackled by the limitations of reality and his studies and what he knows to be true to pursue dreams beyond that. And what is William Hurt saying exactly? What are we saying in this movie? Victor has indirectly caused deaths of everyone he loves, created a monster that wallows in his own misery, and has descended into villainy. And perhaps most relevant to Hurt's class, Victor is a dropout who left the moment things got tough for him. So why is Hurt jealous of a man who brought ruination to himself? What are they trying to say here? Are we trying to argue that Hurt maybe admires Victor for breaking the taboos? That when he talks about breaking God's domain, he himself wishes he could and is speaking out of jealousy? Are we supposed to believe Victor's ambitions are infectious and will drive others like Hurt to similar mania? Like we see in the Universal monster sequels, where like Son of Frankenstein or what have you, where other scientists are drawn into Victor's own mania? I don't really know. Because we leave Hurt after that scene and we don't really follow through with it. We see Victor continue his pursuit of the monster. And it seems kind of odd, especially when given a scene later on involving the captain, which we'll get to in a second. Now, I also think it's implied that during this chase scene, the monster goes back to that village that like ran him out of town and just started killing some of them, which like, fuck them, who cares? They're all jerks. So, but we don't know who he killed, and it's implied because there's some caskets, but we don't really know what he did, and we hope it's maybe not the blind family. We hope it's not them, but it could be anyone. We don't really know. A lot of the violence of the monster is kept off screen because we don't want to see the monster commit really violent things. For example, during this whole chase scene, Victor gets a dog sled, travels into the Arctic, and the monster kills some of the Siberian Huskies. What's with this movie killing dogs? But we don't see the monster kill the dogs, so we don't really get a strong sense of maybe he was just hunting, maybe he just wanted to slow Victor down. But still, a lot of the more violent actions of the monster are not shown on screen. Therefore, it's softened to us, the audience. Anyways, this all leads us back to where we started, with Victor in the captain's quarters telling the story to him. Now, at first, Victor insists the captain needs to finish what Victor started, hunt the monster down and kill it. But after a last-second vision of Elizabeth's ghost, or maybe a spirit or whatever, Victor considers all he lost in his blind pursuits, and instead tells the captain to go home and be with his loved ones. Which in turn comes around the same time the captain's crew concludes they can escape the ice, and if they choose to, turn back now. Now, Don Sutherland was always planning on leaving once the ice broke, because he's not stupid enough to keep traveling into the Arctic. And the crew's celebrating as Victor lets go of his grudge and dies peacefully. This message here is clear that if they keep pushing forward, they might suffer a fate like Victor, and that Victor is finally able to pass peacefully once he finally lets go of his ambitions. And it's here that the monster shows up to privately mourn Victor. And the captain comes and confronts the monster verbally with a pointed conversation. And I really like this bit. Previously in the movie, people talk to the monster like he's a filthy, disgusting freak. But here the captain talks to him like a man who's done something wrong. He speaks to him like an equal. And it's only happened once elsewhere in the film, with the blind grandfather. And so the monster gets a conversation with a human being who accepts him as a person, but still can judge him directly. They quote Paradise Lost to each other. And it's amazing here because you almost get the sense that at any moment, the captain could just pull up a glass of like whiskey and pour the monster a glass or talk to him calmly. But there is that tension there, that the captain does judge Frankenstein for his sins, but not because he's a monster, because he's done terrible things. And the monster admits that even though he hates Victor, he hates himself more for being this freak, of being turned into this monster by society and by the hands of the one person who he could have called his father. Now, in the book, the monster takes Victor and travels into the ice, creating a funeral pyre upon which he'll throw himself and his creator into. But in this version, it's left ambiguous. The monster walks away into the mist and snow with his dead father in his arms, and we're left with an ambiguous future. It's one of the few adaptations that doesn't directly kill the monster at the end or imply a final fate for him. And so that's Hallmark's Frankenstein. How does it hold up? Well, in terms of adaptation of events, it holds up quite well. It does adapt the book almost exactly, with some changes made, mostly in order to service us, the audience, to show us a chance to see the character's internal thoughts. Pacing early on is rough. It is a very slow burn early on, but that slow burn allows us to have a bigger sense of contrast when it gets to the darker stuff at the end. It's kind of the inverse of the It miniseries in the 90s, where the first half is really good and the second half is really bad. In this one, the first half is a lot rougher, but the second half has a lot of good stuff in it that's worth watching, especially for a gothic horror fan. It does have some spooky visuals, especially with the cemetery and crumbling ruins, and that's cool. And it is, again, one of the more faithful adaptations, if not the most to date. Guillermo del Toro still has his coming out, so we'll see how that turns out. But again, is it good? As a movie, is it entertaining? As an adaptation of the ideas of Frankenstein, does it work? Well, while I do think it's good, there's a key element that holds me back from loving it, and that's how it adapts Victor and the monster. Because in this version, Victor is a hero. I've heard an old saying, intelligence is knowing that Frankenstein's not the monster. Wisdom is knowing Frankenstein is the monster. It's one thing to know that the monster is not named Frankenstein in the story, but it's wisdom and experience that tells you that Victor Frankenstein is truly the monster of Frankenstein. Now, that's not to say the monster is purely sympathetic. He does a lot of bad things. In the book, he does decry himself as Satan, as Milton Satan made flesh in many ways. A monster driven to sin against his creator. But there's a lot of love there, and he's driven to it by circumstance. You understand why the monster is the way he is, and while he's horrifying, he's also deeply tragic. But in this adaptation, they want you to love the monster unconditionally, which means shaving off the worst aspects of him. That's one choice. Adaptations have done that before. What's the bigger problem is shaving off Victor's bad behavior. Victor should not be a hero. This adaptation wants you to like both the monster and Victor equally, but that's not really what the story is about. It's about man's selfish ambitions, his refusal to accept consequences for his actions, or look inward to see how his actions affect others. In this sense, the monster is driven to act monstrous because of Victor. And it's only when Victor passes that the monster finds he has nothing left to live for, now that the one focus of his life, his creator, is gone. And likewise, Victor dies all consumed with one ambition, destroying his creation. So what does it all mean? Well, it means the core idea of the story is completely changed in this adaptation. Victor's fate is due to outside circumstances. It's due to him being too ambitious for his own good, rather than too narrow focused. Characters assure us Victor did nothing wrong. Victor is a genius. Victor's brilliant. It's only because he trampled on God's domain and broke the rules that things went wrong, not that he refused to see outside his narrow scope of perspective. And that's where the tragedy and horror is left behind. Tragic characters bring about their own downfalls due to their own tragic flaws. But neither Victor or his monster ultimately fail due to their actions. Victor is often motivated by the perspectives of others, like with Henry, while the monster doesn't piece into the world quite right. A lot of his actions that are seen as violent are him just rubbing up against the limits of society without being built to function in that society. He kills the brother not because of malice, but because he just happened to hold him the wrong way. And a lot of his actions afterwards against Victor are reactionary because Victor refuses to give him a chance at any happiness himself. But Victor is also accountable. And even characters like Victor's father, they blame death pursuing Victor as opposed to Victor bringing death with him. This means we don't absorb the sheer weight of Victor and the monster's actions because there's an excuse. It's not them doing it, it's society, it's circumstance doing it. It feels almost predestined for them to end in the Arctic, suffering. It's because they chose to challenge God as opposed to them challenging the natural order of life and not understanding how that would affect everything else. In the book, Frankenstein is driven to his ambitions because of natural philosophy, but ignores the full scope of the sciences. This is a mention in the film, but we don't see how that really plays into the ideas. Victor is driven because he focused on one set of beliefs and pursued it obsessively. Here, once he gets to college, he realizes he was too narrow focused. That's the story in miniature. Victor's narrow focus and refusal to look outside of what he believes in that instance to be possible brings about his downfall. We don't see that in this version. We see Victor as an ambitious, studious, bookish man who keeps pushing for more and more and never once questions, is it enough? As a result, this adaptation loses the soul of Frankenstein. That being that man ignores the consequences of his own actions. And that's kind of tragic. Even though you get the events right, you lose the theme. James Whale's adaptation, though it completely tosses almost everything out, captures that theme far more effectively than the Hallmark version. Is the Hallmark version without merit? No, it's a worthy adaptation, but it's not a great adaptation. And that's the problem. All in all, an interesting relic from a time where Hallmark once tried pushing the boundaries. I would love to see Hallmark go back to this, but I feel that their Christmas slot machine is just way too successful for their own good.